Part 1. Introduction. The Usual Life. Elizabeth and I have been together for almost half of my life. I remember meeting her at a mutual friend's party. She immediately caught my attention. Her smile, the softness in her voice, and the spark that lit up in her eyes when she talked about her hobbies. It was more than just an attraction. I felt that she was the one I wanted to spend my whole life with. And now, after 20 years of marriage, I still often remember that day as if it were yesterday. Over the years, our life has been going along the usual rut: home, work, children, family weekends, and holidays. We both had careers. I was in a construction company, and Elizabeth worked as an accountant for a large firm. We tried to maintain a balance between work and home, finding time for each other and for our children, although it was not easy. At some point, our work began to take up too much time, and I began to notice that we began to communicate less often as a couple. But I've always thought that it's normal for a long marriage when years of routine can dampen the old passion a little. We have 2 children, and this is one of our main prides. Luca, our eldest son, is now studying at the university, and he is already beginning to think about how to build his life. I always tried to be an example for him, to show that family and hard work are the most important things. Luca grew up to be a responsible and serious young man. He sometimes reminded me of myself at his age, when I was just as eager to win my place in the world. Our daughter Jessica is the youngest. She just turned 18. She recently graduated from high school and decided to take a year for self-development. Elizabeth was a little against this idea, believing that Jessica should immediately go to university, but I supported my daughter. It seemed to me that she needed a little time to find herself, to understand what she wanted to do next. Jessica has always been more creative and free in her thoughts. She was interested in painting, music, literature, and I knew that she would find her calling. She just needed to be given time. We lived in a cozy house that we bought shortly after the wedding. Over the years, the house has become not just a place to sleep, but a real fortress where all the most important moments of our lives took place: the birth of children, the first steps, holidays, even quarrels and reconciliation. I put my soul into this house, as well as into my family. Elizabeth and I often spent evenings on our veranda overlooking the garden. Over the years, we have planted so many trees and flowers there together that the garden has become a kind of symbol of our marriage, growing and strengthening every year. At least, that's what it seemed to me. Elizabeth has always seemed to me the pillar of our home. She was able to keep everything under control. She took care of the children, solved household chores, managed to go to work, and still looked great despite being tired. She was the one who brought us all together, as if her presence made everything a little more cozy and peaceful. We've been through a lot of trials together. There were moments when we didn't have enough money, when we doubted the future, when we lost loved ones, but we always returned to each other, supporting and finding the strength to move on. I remember how she helped me during the most difficult periods of my life, when it seemed to me that I was on the verge. She always found the right words and let me know that there was someone who understood and supported me. Of course, our feelings have changed over the years. In my youth, everything was based on emotions, passion, and now we have become friends rather than lovers. It was that stage of marriage when you look at the person next to you and realize that he has become a part of your life, like air or water, something natural, without which you can no longer exist. Of course, there were moments when we argued, when we had disagreements, but I always thought that everything was fine with us. At least, that's what I thought. Now looking back, I realize that behind all this stability and habit, I might not have noticed the alarm signals. Maybe I didn't pay enough attention to her. Maybe I got stuck in a routine. But at that moment, I was sure that our family was still strong, as it was in the first years of marriage. I was proud that we had gone through all this together, and despite the trials, remained faithful to each other. For me, marriage has always been something sacred. I was raised with the belief that family is the main thing that needs to be protected and preserved. And in Elizabeth, I saw my companion, my only love, who would always be there, no matter what. I didn't know then that my ideal picture of a family was about to begin to crumble. Part 2. Suspicions are the first warning signs. It all started a few months ago, when I noticed the first changes in Elizabeth's behavior. At first, it was the little things that I did not immediately pay attention to. She became a little distant, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away from our house. When she left for work, she stopped turning around to say goodbye with that slight smile that always gave me the feeling that everything was fine. In the evenings, returning home, Elizabeth looked tired, but not with the fatigue that comes from physical work or a long day, but with some kind of inner deep. It was fatigue, which I could not explain either by stress at work or age. She wasn't the same as before. Elizabeth has always been dedicated to her work, but in recent months she has been staying longer and longer. At first, I did not attach much importance to this. We all sometimes fall under the pressure of deadlines and projects. She talked about the new responsibilities she had to take on because of the change in leadership. She seemed to be completely immersed in her work, and I tried to support her as much as I could. When she said she needed to stay late, I reminded myself that it was temporary, that everything would get better, and that she was doing this for our family. But the further it went, the more little things began to catch my eye. Elizabeth's phone was always next to her, as if it were her second skin. She kept it with her everywhere, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, even in bed. Previously, she could easily leave it somewhere on a table or on a shelf without paying attention to it, but now he was her constant companion. Even at night, when we went to bed, I noticed that she put her phone under her pillow. Her screen often blinked when she thought I was asleep. I felt uneasy, but I tried not to jump to conclusions. I told myself that these were normal work messages, that she was going through a difficult period, and she just didn't want to lose control of the situation. However, her changes were not only in the phone. She began to avoid direct eye contact. When I looked at her, it seemed that her gaze had become somehow empty. Previously, there had always been warmth in her eyes. There was that quiet understanding that is developed in a couple over many years of living together. We could exchange glances and immediately understand each other without words, but now that wasn't the case. She looked right through me, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away. I missed that twinkle in her eyes that always gave me confidence that everything was fine between us. Sometimes in the evenings, when we were having dinner with the whole family, I caught myself that Elizabeth hardly took part in the conversation. She was listening to us, but her attention was directed somewhere far away, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of a napkin or a mug of tea. She looked lost in thought. When I asked her what was wrong, she replied something like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was just thinking about work," or "I'm just tired." I wanted to believe that it was really about work, that these were temporary difficulties, but anxiety was growing inside me. It was like a fog that was slowly enveloping our relationship, and I couldn't find a way to dispel it. We talked less and less about personal matters. Evenings used to be ours. Even after a long day, we could discuss everything from weekend plans to memories of our youth. We laughed, shared our experiences and joys, but now those conversations have disappeared. When I tried to start a conversation, Elizabeth would respond in monosyllables, or just laugh it off, avoiding serious topics. Our evenings became silent, filled only with the noise of the TV or the sounds outside the window. I felt distant from her, as if a wall had formed between us that I couldn't break through. One of the strangest moments was that she stopped taking the initiative in our relationship. Intimacy between us became rare, and when it did happen, it was mechanical, without the previous passion. It seemed to me that she did it out of habit rather than out of desire. At some point, I started blaming myself for this. I thought maybe I was just not paying as much attention to her as I needed to, that I had become boring or predictable to her. I tried to find ways to restore the spark, but my efforts were not yielding results. It was a cold emptiness, and it scared me. Over time, suspicions began to gnaw at me from the inside. I wanted to be sure that it was all just my imagination, that Elizabeth was really just tired. But every time she came home late, when her phone was flashing at night, when her eyes avoided mine, it all accumulated and every day increased my doubts. I didn't want to believe the worst, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. One evening, I decided to ask her directly. We were sitting at dinner. The children had already gone to their rooms, and I felt that I could no longer tolerate this uncertainty. I sighed and put down my fork and asked, "Elizabeth, what's going on? You've become different. You're moving away from me. I see it, and it bothers me." She looked up at me, a little surprised, as if I had asked something unexpected. "Are you serious?" She tried to smile, but there was no warmth in her smile. "It's okay, Michael. It's just a difficult period at work right now. One project after another, and I'm exhausted. It's nothing serious, really." I wanted to believe her. I really wanted to, but her eyes slid away again, and I realized that this was not the whole truth. There was something behind those words, something she didn't want or couldn't say. That night was a turning point. I couldn't ignore my suspicions anymore, but I didn't know what to do either. Doubts were eating away at me from the inside, and I felt that I was standing on the edge of something very important that could change my whole life. Part 3. Contacting a private investigator. My suspicions turned more and more into an oppressive feeling that would not let me go day or night. Every time Elizabeth stayed late at work or went to meetings with colleagues, anxiety grew inside me. I could no longer deceive myself and write off her behavior as fatigue or temporary difficulties. She was moving away from me, and I could feel it with every nerve in my body. But the worst part was that I couldn't figure out exactly what was going on. One evening, when Elizabeth said again that she had to stay at work late at night because of some important report, I couldn't stand it anymore. It was too much for me. I was sitting in the living room, looking out the window at the darkening garden, and thoughts were bothering me. The doubts became unbearable. I was willing to do anything to find out the truth, even if it turned out to be painful. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer live in such a state of uncertainty and anxiety. I needed answers. The decision to turn to a private detective came unexpectedly. One of my old friends, with whom we recently met over beer, mentioned that his acquaintance once faced a similar situation and solved it with the help of a professional. I remembered his words. "If you need to know the truth, sometimes it's better to trust the professionals." Then I brushed off this conversation, believing that it was not about me. But now I couldn't forget about that possibility. If anyone could help me find out the truth, it was a private investigator. Picking up the phone, I dialed a friend's number and, with a little hesitation, asked if he could recommend that detective to me. My friend seemed to understand that I was not just curious, but did not ask unnecessary questions. He gave me the contacts of a detective named Mark, saying that he was a reliable and experienced professional who knew his business. I sat with the phone in my hands for a long time before I decided to call. Two feelings were fighting in me. One said that it was a betrayal to spy on my own wife, that they didn't do that I should trust her. But the second, stronger one, insisted that I needed to know the truth, whatever it was. The uncertainty was destroying me from the inside out, and I realized that without clarity, I would no longer be able to live a normal life. When I finally called Mark, the voice on the phone was calm and confident. He listened to me without asking too many questions and offered to meet me the next day. We agreed to meet in a cafe to discuss everything in detail. I felt awkward and even a little guilty, but after gathering my thoughts, I still accepted it as the only way to find out the truth. The next day, when I went into the cafe, I immediately recognized Mark. He was a middle-aged man with penetrating eyes and a serious but not cold expression. He looked like he had seen everything in this world and was ready to handle any situation. I sat down opposite him, and he nodded and invited me to tell him what was the matter. It was hard for me to talk about it out loud. It seemed that my words made everything that was happening real, confirmed my worst fears. I told him about how Elizabeth had changed in recent months, how she had become detached, how her phone was always at hand, and how she was increasingly late at work. Mark listened attentively, without interrupting, and only nodded his head occasionally, making it clear that he understood what I was going through. When I finished, Mark said calmly, "I understand, Michael. It's not an easy situation, but if you really want to know the truth, I can help. You need to be prepared for the fact that the answers may be unpleasant. Are you sure you want to go all the way?" These words of his made me think again. Was I ready to find out the truth, even if it turned out to be what I was most afraid of? I knew that it could destroy everything, but at the same time I realized that I could no longer live in doubt. I nodded. Mark explained how the investigation would proceed. He did not go into technical details, but said that he would start monitoring Elizabeth's movements, find out who she was dating, and what she was doing when she claimed to be working. He was professional to the smallest detail and clearly understood what to do and how to do it. I felt like I could trust him. He immediately got down to business, promising to keep me informed of developments. When I left the cafe, I was overcome with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I felt relieved that I had finally done something. It was better than sitting and suffering in anticipation. But on the other hand, I felt like a traitor. Hiring a detective to keep an eye on your own wife, it was a difficult decision, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive myself for it. But doubts were tearing me apart from the inside, and this was the only way to find out the truth. Part 4. Capture, Exposure of Treason. It's been a week since Mark started following Elizabeth. I tried to behave as usual, although everything inside me was burning with anxiety and fear of the truth. Every late call or delay at work was now perceived by me as another confirmation that something was wrong. Deep down, I already knew the answer, but I still hoped it was just the fruit of my doubts and worries. I was looking for salvation in everyday little things, convincing myself that this could be a mistake, that I was dramatizing in vain. But the truth was closer than I wanted to admit. One evening, when Elizabeth said again that she needed to stay late at work, I received a message from Mark. It was short and succinct. I got the evidence. We need to meet. Those words made my stomach turn cold. My heart began to beat faster, and the most terrible thoughts began to rush through my head. I knew that meeting Mark would bring me final clarity, but I wasn't ready for what I was going to hear. The truth could break everything I knew about my life, about my marriage, about the woman I had loved for more than 20 years. We met at the same cafe where we spoke for the first time. Mark was already sitting at the table when I came in. His face, as always, was calm, but I noticed a seriousness in his eyes. It didn't bode well. He nodded at me, inviting me to sit down. I didn't hesitate, sat down opposite, and tried to prepare myself for what was going to happen. Tension hung in the air. Mark opened his tablet and put it in front of me. Photos appeared on the screen. The first thing I saw was Elizabeth coming out of the office where she worked. I recognized her immediately. A formal business suit, her hair neatly tucked away. Everything looked familiar until Mark showed me the next photo. She was with him, with James, her boss. They walked side by side, her face beaming with a smile, and it hurt more than I could have imagined. It was not the smile of a tired man after a hard day's work. She was laughing, her eyes were shining, and at that moment I realized that all my worst suspicions were coming true. "That's not all," Mark said quietly, switching the image. The next shot showed them both near the entrance to the hotel. They went inside, and then the ground seemed to open up under my feet. My heart sank, and I felt my hands go cold. It flashed through my head. Is this really true? Is this really happening? Mark continued to show the photos. They were done a few hours later. Elizabeth and James were leaving the room, already dressed unusually for a working evening. Her hair was disheveled, and there was still a slight smile on her face. I looked at it and felt like the world was collapsing around me. It was a betrayal that I never expected from her. I remembered all our conversations, all those evenings when she said she needed to stay late at work, when I believed that she was just tired and needed rest. And she's been doing it all this time. I couldn't watch anymore. Mark, realizing that I was shocked, put the tablet away and looked at me sympathetically, but without unnecessary words. He had seen this many times, and he knew that I had to deal with this pain on my own. "That's all," he said. "Do you need any more evidence or information?" I shook my head, unable to speak. Everything in front of me made it clear enough that the truth was even worse than I could have imagined. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, and the same questions were in my head. Why? How could she? I still couldn't figure out how this became possible. We lived together for more than 20 years. We had grown-up children whom we raised with love. I thought our marriage was strong, that we had been through so many trials together and had always remained faithful to each other. I could not imagine that Elizabeth could decide to cheat, and with someone from her job, and even with her boss. We trusted each other, or at least I thought we did. When I left the cafe, it was already dark outside. I walked without knowing where I was going, just trying to make sense of everything I had just learned. My heart felt heavy, as if a huge weight had been placed on my shoulders. The air seemed thick and the footsteps muffled. The world around him no longer seemed the same as before. Everything has changed. I don't remember how I got home. When I opened the door and entered our familiar, cozy house that Elizabeth and I had built together, I was overcome by emptiness. Everything reminded me of our years together. Photos on the walls, gifts from children that we gave to each other. It was our home, but now it seemed like a stranger to me. Elizabeth was still at work, and I was left alone sitting in our living room. I looked at the empty chair opposite, where she usually sat in the evenings, and I couldn't believe that everything I knew turned out to be a lie. My trust, my love, it all seemed destroyed now. Part 5. Collision. A conversation with Elizabeth. The next day was a turning point in our lives. I could no longer delay and hide my knowledge. A hurricane of emotions raged inside me. Anger, pain, betrayal, but on the surface I was surprisingly calm. The calmness that came to me was frightening. It was not a sign of peace, but rather the opposite. It was an awareness of the inevitable. I knew that this evening would end with a conversation that would change everything. When Elizabeth returned home after another working evening, I was already waiting for her in the living room. The lights were dimmed, and the atmosphere in the room seemed thick and tense. She came into the house with her usual smile, but I could see that she wasn't so confident this time. Maybe she felt that something was wrong, or maybe my cold silence alerted her. When she saw me sitting on the couch with the photos on the table in front of me, her smile instantly disappeared. There was something like fright in her eyes. She froze on the threshold, as if she couldn't make up her mind to enter the room. I didn't hesitate. I didn't want to start this conversation with meaningful pauses or hints. I wasn't someone who could keep the pain for long. Taking the first photo from the pack, I held it up so that Elizabeth could see it. It was an image of her and James walking down the street together, her hand on his shoulder and his on her waist. Elizabeth's face paled as soon as she realized what kind of photo it was. She took a step back, her hands shaking. "Michael," she whispered, but her voice was weak and lifeless. I didn't let her continue. Silently, I put another photo in front of her, in which they'd both entered the hotel. I looked at her face, at how her eyes widened in horror, how her lips began to tremble, trying to say something. But the words seemed to stick in her throat. "What is it?" I finally asked calmly, breaking the oppressive silence. My voice was quiet, but cold as ice. I didn't raise it. I didn't shout. I just wanted to know. Elizabeth was looking at the photos, and I could see her confidence crumbling before her eyes. For the first few minutes, she just stood there as if she couldn't believe this was happening. But then she lowered her head and tears appeared in her eyes. She knew she had no way out. All her excuses and lies no longer made sense. The evidence was in front of us. "Michael, she began, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. It was." Her attempts to explain something sounded pathetic and unconvincing. I could see how she was trying to find at least some words to justify herself, but nothing came out. She knew that I already knew everything, that none of her words would change what had happened. "Not what I think it is," I repeated, getting up from my seat. "Then what is it? Explain to me, Elizabeth, what should I think when I see you and your boss, James, spending time at the hotel when you should be at work?" My question caught her off guard. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if that could save her from the reality that now surrounded her on every side. I came closer, putting some more photos in front of her. She didn't try to speak anymore. I saw how she broke down internally, how her world was crumbling. And then it started. Elizabeth, no longer able to contain her emotions, burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. I stood in front of her, not moving, not touching her, not comforting her. I knew that this moment was her downfall, and I couldn't help her with it. She began to speak, through sobs, incoherent words, apologies, explanations. "It was a mistake," she was crying. "I do not know how it happened, Michael. I didn't get enough attention, and James, he knew how to make me feel needed. But it's not what you think. It didn't mean anything." I stood listening to her pathetic excuses, feeling the pain I was feeling gradually give way to emptiness. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't screaming, as she might have expected. My reaction was different. My silence, my icy calm, seemed to tear her apart more than if I had let anger overwhelm me. "It didn't mean anything," I repeated calmly. "Elizabeth, we've been together for over 20 years. We built this house, raised the children. Are you trying to tell me that it didn't mean anything?" She started sobbing again, her body was shaking, and she knelt down on the floor in front of me, begging me to listen to her. But her words no longer mattered. I could see that she didn't realize that everything had changed. She still thought it could be fixed, that I could forgive her. "I don't know who you are anymore," I finally said, slowly turning away. "And to be honest, I'm not even sure if I want to know." I couldn't look at her anymore. All her words about James's manipulations, about how she missed my attention, sounded like a cheap excuse. My hands were shaking, but I held myself in check, realizing that no amount of her confessions would bring back to me what had been destroyed. When I went into the bedroom, leaving her on her knees in the living room, I could hear her crying, but I could no longer feel sympathy. I no longer saw her as the woman I had lived with for 20 years. She was a stranger, and at that moment I realized that it was no longer possible to return to what had been. This evening changed everything. Part 6. The Decision. The Consequences of Treason. The night I left Elizabeth crying on the living room floor was a turning point. I lay in our bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and thought about how cheating had destroyed everything we had built together. The anger I felt in the first few minutes after I found out the truth has now been replaced by deep pain and a sense of emptiness. I realized that I could no longer look at our lives the same way as before. Everything had changed, and I wasn't ready to forgive her. The following days were difficult. We didn't talk much. Elizabeth tried to talk to me again, apologize again, explain again why it happened, but I no longer wanted to hear her excuses. My heart was too broken, and my trust was completely destroyed. Every word she said sounded like a lie. I saw before me the woman I had spent 20 years with, but she was no longer the Elizabeth I knew and loved. It was the hardest realization. At that moment, I made a decision for myself that seemed inevitable. I decided to file for divorce. I wasn't ready to continue living with a man who had betrayed me so much. Cheating left deep scars that I knew I couldn't heal. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't trust her anymore. I understood that our children were adults and had their own lives, but that didn't make the decision any easier. I started thinking about the best way to tell the children. I didn't want our divorce to ruin their world. I decided to act tactfully. I didn't want them to see my mother only as guilty. She was still a mother to them, and even though I felt hurt, I knew I had to be wiser. My task was to protect them from the chaos that was unfolding between us. One evening, I gathered them both at our house. Elizabeth was not there this time. I asked her to leave so that I could talk to the children alone. Luca, who was already a student at the university, sat in front of me with a serious expression on his face. Jessica was a little more nervous, but she was also listening intently. I sighed, trying to find the right words. "Kids," I began quietly, "there's something we need to talk about. Your mother and I have decided to divorce." These words hung in the air like a heavy blanket that enveloped us all. I saw their faces change from bewilderment to shock. I understood that this was unexpected for them, because they always saw Elizabeth and me as a strong couple. "But why, Dad?" Jessica asked, her eyes filling with tears. I sighed again. It was the most difficult moment. I couldn't tell them the whole truth. I didn't want to ruin their relationship with their mother. But I knew I had to be honest, at least partially. "It's hard for your mom and me to be together right now," I said calmly. "Sometimes in life it happens that relationships change and people decide that they need to move on separately. It's not your fault, and I hope you'll understand us. We will always be here for you, and I hope that you will continue to love and support both of us." Luca was silent, his jaw clenched. He was older and probably understood more than he was saying. Jessica started crying, and I couldn't help but go over to hug her. She was sobbing, and I was holding her, trying to hold back my own tears. "We'll manage," I told them, trying to give them confidence. "It's hard, but I believe that everything will be fine." That was the end of our conversation, and I knew that they took the news hard, but without blaming anyone. It was important for me to maintain balance and calmness so that their world would not collapse with our marriage. Meanwhile, I continued to act. I didn't want to leave this situation without consequences for James, her boss. I felt that he should also be punished for his role in this betrayal. I anonymously reported his relationship with a subordinate to the management of the company where they both worked. For me, it was an act of justice. Soon after, James was fired. In a corporate environment, the relationship between a boss and a subordinate is a serious violation, and this was his downfall. He lost not only his position, but also his reputation, and I felt that it was a well-deserved punishment. It didn't bring me back peace, but it became a symbol of justice in a world where betrayal so often goes unpunished. Elizabeth found herself in a difficult situation. Her dismissal was not a public scandal, but it was enough for her to feel the consequences of her actions. She was left without a job, and with it she lost some of the respect she had built over the years. I saw in her eyes that she realized that she had ruined her life with her own hands. We no longer had a heart-to-heart conversation. All our communication was reduced to formalities about children and paperwork on divorce. Our divorce wasn't violent. It passed quickly and calmly, just like our life together in recent months. But despite this, Elizabeth has changed. I could see that she was no longer the woman who had once seemed confident and independent to me. Her infidelity and subsequent events destroyed not only our marriage, but also her. She lost her job, the respect of her colleagues, and perhaps a part of herself. Her eyes were no longer shining, and this was the result of her own actions. I felt different. Of course, the pain of betrayal did not go away, but I felt that I had done the right thing. I kept my dignity and found a way to deal with the situation without losing myself. My life had changed, but I was ready for a new beginning, free from lies and betrayal. In the end, despite the pain and destruction, I retained the main thing, my pride and self-respect. Part 7. A New Life. Prospects. Divorce, no matter how hard it was to go through, turned out to be a kind of liberation for me. It has been several months since everything was officially completed, and life began to take on new shapes. These changes reminded me of the calm after a stormy storm. It was quiet calm, but I still felt the bitterness of what had happened. The house was empty when Elizabeth left. I was left alone in our family nest, surrounded by memories that now brought more pain than joy. But even alone, I felt strangely relieved. At first, I didn't know how to handle this new stage. My routine, once tied to family life, has fallen apart. It seemed that every corner of the house was saturated with memories. The laughter of the children, dinners with Elizabeth, our conversations about the future, which now no longer made sense. But despite this, something inside me felt that I had managed to preserve the most important thing, my dignity and self-respect. I was the one who weathered the storm despite the blows that hit my heart. My life began to rebuild gradually. One of the most important aspects was my relationship with the children. Luca and Jessica were not just a support for me during this difficult time, but also an incentive to move forward. They also experienced their mother's betrayal, but despite the pain, I always told them that Elizabeth would remain their mother, and that would not change. I didn't want them to feel divided between us. It was hard enough for them as it was. Every time I talked to them, I tried to remind them that our family, despite the divorce, did not cease to exist. We were together, and that's the main thing. Luca, my eldest son, was mature enough to understand the complexity of the situation. He didn't tell me anything specific about how he took his mother's action, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. We talked a lot after the divorce, more than before. Our conversations have become deeper and more open. He often came home on weekends from university, and it filled the house with life. There was support in his words, and I could see how he was trying to be strong so as not to burden me with unnecessary worries. To some extent, he became a support for me, although it had always been my role in his life before. Jessica, on the other hand, experienced everything differently. Her heart was broken, just like mine, but in its own way. She was closer to her mother, and Elizabeth's betrayal hit her harder. Her tears in the first days after the divorce remained in my memory, and it was hard for me to see how she was trying to cope with it. But over time, when we started spending more time together, I felt that our relationship became stronger. We talked about everything from her future plans to simple life moments, and it helped us get closer. One day, Jessica and I were sitting in the back garden, where I often spent time when I wanted to be alone. It was a warm evening, and she suddenly said, "Dad, I think that despite all this, you will remain the best person I know." Her words touched me to the core. I understood that this was her way of expressing appreciation for the way I handled the situation. I didn't let anger and disappointment destroy the family, and she appreciated it. Elizabeth continued her life separately. She lost her job and realized that she had ruined everything we had. Sometimes I thought about her, but not with hatred or anger, but with a certain bitterness and regret. She was the woman I spent 20 years of my life with, the mother of my children, but she was no longer the person I knew her to be. Our paths parted, and I've come to terms with it. The only thing I asked of life was peace and the opportunity to move on. As for the new relationship, I knew that now was not the time. My wound was too fresh, and I felt that I needed time to find inner peace. There were moments when I thought about what it would be like to trust someone again, to open my heart after everything that happened. But now it was more important for me to restore myself. I realized that inner peace and a sense of completion were what I had to find first. I started to take more care of myself, getting carried away with things that I didn't have enough time for before. My life has revolved around family, work, and household chores for a long time, but now I have found the strength and time for hobbies that I abandoned a long time ago. I started reading the books that had been piling up on the shelves for years again. I took up gardening. It brought me an amazing feeling of peace when I worked with the land, creating something new, real. I even started exercising to keep my body and spirit in good shape. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was returning to myself. Life became slow measured, but that was what I needed. I learned to live in silence, without the stress and anxiety that were a part of my life in the last months of my marriage. I didn't have to hurry, and it gave me a sense of freedom. Sometimes it seemed to me that despite the divorce, I had found a new chance at life. Will I be ready for a new relationship in the future? Maybe. I did not rule out this possibility, but I did not look for it. My task now is to find a balance within myself. I knew that new perspectives would come when I was ready for them. In the meantime, I was enjoying this moment, a moment of recovery and calm. There were still many questions in the future. Will my life be the way I imagined it? Will I be able to trust again? Will I be able to build a new relationship without looking back at the past? These questions still remained unanswered, but I felt that the time I have now is my chance to sort myself out and find that inner peace that I needed so much. And although the pain of betrayal hadn't completely gone away yet, I knew one thing: I could handle it. The epilogue. It's been a few years since Elizabeth and I finally parted ways. Time has healed the wounds, leaving only scars in my memory, reminding me of the events that changed my life. My life took on a new direction, although in those early days after the divorce, it seemed almost impossible. Looking back now, I realize that it was not just a painful stage, but a life lesson for both me and Elizabeth. For Elizabeth, the consequences of her choice were disastrous. After our divorce, her life began to crumble. She lost not only her family, but also the respect she had built in society for many years. Her betrayal was not just a moment of weakness, but a destructive whirlwind that demolished everything in its path. Our mutual friends, colleagues, and neighbors, after learning about what happened, gradually distanced themselves from her. A reputation that once seemed unshakable has been destroyed. Her job, the one she said forced her to stay up late, was no longer her anchor. After I informed the management of the company about her relationship with James, her boss, she lost her place in the firm. James, in turn, was fired even faster. Their romance, which may have seemed more than just a mistake in her eyes, turned out to be empty and fleeting. After his dismissal, they no longer kept in touch. James disappeared from her life as if he had never existed, leaving Elizabeth alone with its consequences. She tried to find a new job, but her reputation, tarnished by scandal, followed her everywhere. Despite her professional skills and experience, it was difficult for her to find a new position in her former field. She was no longer the woman everyone admired and listened to in meetings. Her confidence was shaken, and this was reflected in her appearance and behavior. Elizabeth, whom I had known for 20 years, seemed like a completely different person. I no longer communicated with her directly, but sometimes I heard about her life through the children. She was left alone, unable to rebuild either her career or her personal life. The children continued to keep in touch with her, which was important to me. Despite what she did, I always told them that a mother would remain a mother, no matter what happened between us. Luca and Jessica visited her regularly, although their relationship with Elizabeth had also changed. They no longer saw in her the ideal she had been to them before, but they still stayed in touch with her, helping her cope with loneliness, at least from a distance. My life, on the contrary, has taken a different path. After the divorce, I got not only freedom, but also the opportunity to start all over again. Although it was difficult at first to adapt to the new reality, I gradually learned to live without those emotional attachments that pulled me back. I no longer felt bound by lies and betrayal. My heart was broken, but it was healing, and with each new day, I felt like I was finding myself again. The house I stayed in was no longer a museum of memories. I rebuilt it so that it no longer reminds me of the past. Renovated rooms, new pieces of furniture, photographs of children. All this became part of the new life that I began to build. Luca and Jessica still came to see me often, and we spent a lot of time together. Our relationship became even stronger, and I felt that now we understand each other on a deep level. The divorce didn't destroy our bond. On the contrary, it made her stronger. As for personal relationships, I was not immediately ready for a new stage. It took a while before I could open my heart again. I met several women with whom communication seemed easy and relaxed, but I did not strive for something serious. I realized that I needed time to recover emotionally and find inner peace, but over time, I felt ready to trust again. It was like a new dawn after a long night. I didn't know what it would lead to, but I was ready to accept the challenge. The lessons I learned from this story have become an important part of my inner growth. I realized that relationships should be built on mutual trust and respect, and that any betrayal, no matter how small it may seem, can destroy everything. I've also learned to let go of the past. Elizabeth, no matter how much she hurt me, was no longer a part of my life, and I learned to forgive. Not her. I wasn't ready to forgive the betrayal, but myself for letting it happen. Self-forgiveness has become an important step towards inner peace. This story has left scars, but it has also been a catalyst for change. I realized that life goes on, even when it seems that everything has collapsed. Betrayal, pain, divorce, all this was just part of a longer journey that eventually led me to a new understanding of myself and life. I was no longer the person who lived in the shadow of betrayal. Now I was free, and new horizons were opening up before me. Elizabeth is in the past. Her life has become a reminder that making the wrong decisions can destroy everything you've been building for years. She lost her family, her career, and her respect. Perhaps she realized her mistake too late, when nothing could be returned, but each of us got what we deserved. She is the consequences of her actions. I am freedom and the opportunity to move forward. Now I was ready for new opportunities, new relationships, and most importantly, a new life. A life where I was honest with myself and those around me. A life where trust and respect came first. Dear friends, thank you for listening to this story. If you like my content, please rate this video with a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Have a nice day.